Hello and welcome everyone to this Inno talk by Food and Biocluster Denmark. I am Heidi Højt Dyrholm and I work for the Danish National Cluster for Innovation and Transformation of the Danish food and bioresource industries. And today's Inno talk is going to be about the big climate database that was launched in January this year. And this is why I have invited Yannick Smith, the scientist and expert behind the database, to talk with us today so that we can learn about the ideas behind the database, how to use it in practice, and to answer your questions. And I see that we are receiving questions already now. Thank you to all of you who are following the Inno talk from home or from work. We love questions, and we also like to know that you are here. And that is why I would like you to sign up through the form that is to the right of the video. And if you have any questions, please fill them in the form below the video. And that way I will receive your questions live and we will take them as we go. If any questions are not being answered as we go, we will try to wrap up after we finish today and get Yannick to answer some of your questions. Those that have signed up to the right will receive an email with today's presentation and the comments and questions that we have extracted from today's presentation. I'm so happy that you are here with me today, Jannick Schmidt. And we were discussing before that it would be lovely that you give a short introduction of yourself before we dig into the big climate database.
Sure, thank you. My name is Yannick Smith. I'm associate professor at Aalborg University. And besides that, I'm the CEO of Concito LCA Consultants. I've been working with LCA, or life cycle assessment, for the last 20 years. I am the main developer of the food database, the big climate database, which is today's topic. I'm working with LCA applied to everything from the very, very micro level to the very, very global level. We are developing databases and we are doing dedicated studies on specific technologies.
Thank you. And this is leading us to, well, you are developing from the smallest to the largest, but we are specifically talking about the big climate database launched by Concito in January this year and by Selling Group as a sponsor. Can you talk us through what were the ideas behind it? Why was there a need for this database, first of all?
Sure, I can do that. First of all, as you say, the database is funded by Selling Foundations and it's developed by Concito LCA Consultants and Concito. But then the question is, of course, why did all this happen? First of all, food has an enormous impact on climate. Not only climate, but that's the focus of the current database. So almost 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by food and the food product chains. There's a huge demand for reducing these 30%. So there's a demand to guide the mitigation. And finally, there's a demand for harmonizing and for having precise and scientifically sound data. And just to give you a brief example, I just did a quick Google search and I found results for beef ranging from 50 to 100 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram beef and all the way down to minus CO2 emissions. So there is really a need for harmonizing data. The target group of the database is consumers, retail and food service sectors. Today we'll be talking more about that, how we can use this big climate database, so we'll come back to that. And what does it include, the database? It includes detailed greenhouse gas data for 500 different food items at retail.
And these 500 food products are the most used in the Danish food retailers, is that correct?
Partly correct. They were selected according to several criteria, and one of the criteria is that it should be the most used. But if we have two different similar products on the top, then we choose only one. So it's also a criteria to have representative products.
Okay. We were discussing also that this this is a huge thing. There are many ways to calculate the climate impact of any product. And in our preparation, you've also been mentioning that there are a couple of methods to do so. You mentioned the attributional method and also the consequential method, or LCA. Could I ask you to explain that in just a little detail without going too much in detail?
Sure, I can do that. You already mentioned the consequential method. If you take a look at the slide right now, that's the one described in the top. It's the approach that follows the most acknowledged ISO standard on life cycle assessment. And it's characterized by being based on cause-effect relationships. So if I buy an apple, then I'm tracing back what is happening if I'm buying this apple compared to not buying the apple. So I'm comparing a world with and without this additional apple. There you would focus on mass balances and other balances, and that's also where we include these so-called indirect land use changes. That's a topic we'll probably get back to later. On the contrary, we have the attributional approach, which is fundamentally different. It is not following a cause-effect relationship. If you look in the bottom of the slide, you see on the screen right now, it does not say attributional, but the EU PEF, that is Product Environmental Footprint guideline, is an example of an attributional LCA guideline. Here, that is characterized by, first of all, it's a guideline that is made by a consensus of several industries, and not necessarily scientists, and it's not following scientific principles. It does not respect mass balances. Also, if you're looking at byproducts, I guess most people know that if you have a cow, you have milk and beef coming out of that cow. And if you are doing what is the PEF tells you to do, then you are dividing the cow into two. So you have half a cow that produces milk and the other half is producing beef. Of course, that is not possible in reality, and that's also an example of which kind of problems that leads to. Finally, an attributional LCA approach will follow average industries. And here the classic example is electricity. So you will apply the average electricity mix. But if I'm demanding more or less electricity, it's not so that the average will turn up and down. There will be some electricity producers who would not react to any changes in demand. They are what we call constrained. So if we have an average, then we will include something in our system which is not affected by our decisions. That's as short as possible explained the difference.
All right, and that is coming to my next question. So what is it then you are including when you are calculating for the big climate database? I know that you have a pretty quick answer to that question.
Yeah.
Which is
everything.
You count everything.
Nothing is left out of the database. We use a so-called, in LCA, you are talking about what you include and what you exclude is characterized by the term cutoff criteria.
Yeah.
Cutoff means what you take out, and
yep.
everything is included here. So that will be everything from the cleaning services that goes into a dairy company that producing milk. Also, if you have a farmer who pays, who has a loan in the bank and he is paying rent, the bank activities are included as well. Of course, all these things are minor. The focus is obviously on the important flows, but it just means that everything is included.
That calls for a lot of data.
It does.
Yeah,
it does.
Calls for a lot of input, I suppose. We're going to get back to this. Will you take us a little more through the methods that you're using for calculating?
Absolutely. I think the first thing I will introduce you to is the life cycle perspective. So for those of you who are not 100% familiar with that, or if you're just interested in learning a bit more of what is included, then I have prepared a slide here. You see from this slide we have included, we have basically first you need to see that there are actually two major boxes on the slide. There's one called a background system, that's the biggest box you see. And then the next box is called a foreground system. A background system, that's something where we have not collected specifically data for this big climate database. That's production of electricity, production of fertilizer, extraction of diesel, production of machinery, etc. These data are taken from another database, and that's what we call a background database. And here we are using a hybrid input-output database called Exiobase.
Exiobase.
Exactly.
Made by whom?
It's an output of, in total, 4 or maybe more EU projects, which has been developed since 2007. If we then move or zoom a little bit in on towards the middle of the slide, then you see the next box, that's the foreground system. The foreground system represents what we have been specifically working with in this study here. So we have in detail modeled everything that relates to crops. We have created crop markets. That's if you move from the crops and they follow the arrow. So you can have a market for banana in Denmark. Then we take into account what is the share of banana from Panama and from Costa Rica, and etc. Some of the crops, they can be purchased. The banana, you can buy it in the supermarket. But other crops, such as barley or wheat, they are sometimes used as feed in animal activities. So they go into animal production. Again, animal production, they are traded on global markets. So you'll see out of the animal box, there are markets. So if we are buying beef in the Danish market, we take into account how much beef comes from Brazil and US and Ireland, etc. Then we have the food manufacturing industries, which is slaughterhouses and also other, that's where we make pre-prepared pizzas, etc. And then finally we have a retail sector to the very right. In the top you see packaging, which is also modeled in detail. Then what we count is for every single box. Imagine that every crop or every market or every animal has its own box, and out of this box comes emissions. So I've just highlighted the 3 major greenhouse gas emissions, which is CH4, methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. These emissions are multiplied with what we call characterization factors to convert everything in CO2 equivalents. So that's what is in there. Then I also mentioned that we have 500 different food items in the Danish market. It's not so that we only have 500 food items. That's just the top of the iceberg. So below there, in the foreground system I mentioned before, we have developed more than 12,000 data sets. And that links to a background database, which has more than 16,000 data sets. So there's lots of small connected boxes with each their emissions coming out of them. To go on, interrupt me if there's something to be.
Let me see if I have gotten some questions already by now. I am seeing here that I get emails, but they're empty. So I have 2 emails, the last ones from Mikael and George. Please resend your questions and fill in the place where your question should be. This is in the form below the video if you want a question answered. If instead it is because you want to sign up, it's to your right compared with the video that you're watching. I did have a question myself to what you are telling us here, because it does sound complex. I'm just a user. I'm not a food company, food producer, as many of the listeners here today are. But if I'm trying to rephrase some of what you're saying, it sounds like you are not only calculating the use of any food as by today, but you are also calculating the consequences of a change in use. Yeah. If I'm not wrong.
That's true.
Right. Okay. So, but it does call for a lot of information, and you depend on these international databases for.
That's true.
For extracting some information. Yeah. We'll get back to that later, as I see many questions arising for the future, and this is what we're going to get back to. Okay. I think, are we ready for digging a little more down for the model that you're working from? Yeah. Now, let me see, no more questions, but I'm ready to take them. And I have seen your question, Torsten. We will take that when it fits into our schedule here.
All right. To go back to the data, I've put a slide on the screen right now, and it has 2 bullets. It says the conventional or simple approach to LCA. That's where we are dealing with one LCA process at the time. It could be that now we want to focus at wheat cultivation in Germany, and then we collect data on fertilizer consumption, we calculate the emissions, we collect data on diesel, etc., etc. That's not how we have done in the big climate database. Here we have calculated everything in one go instead. But of course, a question then would be, how do we do that? We have bulk downloaded a lot of databases, or a lot of data from international databases. One, as I have listed here, is the Faustat database, which contain data for 185 crops in 245 countries. There we have data on the harvested area of each crop, the yield, and also organic soils. That's soils with a lot of carbon. If you cultivate these, then you have a lot of emissions. That's some of the debates in the Danish climate policy that's also focusing quite a lot of these soils. We have also made a bulk download of whatever we can find in the International Fertilizer Association's database, where we have gained data on the use of fertilizer per country. Not crop specific, it's just the use of fertilizer at the country level. So then the exercise now is to combine these fertilizer data with each crop. Here we are using fertilizer recommendations and also the harvested area to allocate all these fertilizers into each crop. Then we have a very good estimation of how much fertilizer does each crop receive. And finally, then we have all the data that can be plugged into a parameterized version of the IPCC models for emissions calculations. Then when we combine all these data, here an example of a data set for oil palm cultivation in Indonesia, where you can see what are the inputs and what are the emissions. And we have done that for 3,500 data sets in one go. We have used a similar approach for all the animal activities. So that's the calculation process.
Okay. Is there anything that has surprised you when you've been doing your calculations? That you've now, when gathering all this information, you came out with something very concrete, which is the impact per product, and anything that surprised you when summing up the conclusions there?
I would say surprisingly few surprises.
Okay.
We have been working with LCA applied to food in so many years. Of course, we identified a couple of outliers in the beginning. So most of the surprises, they relate to if there's an error in statistical data, then there will be an error, a similar error in the result in the end.
Of course.
So of course, we have been digging out or identifying some of these outliers in statistics.
Okay.
There was something about pumpkins in Australia, but that has been fixed.
The detail about pumpkins in Australia. I've actually got a question, because this is where people sitting here do have their own products and that they take into account. So we have a question on vanilla. It says here, this may be too specific, this will be up to you to judge, but then please contact me later. I want to understand the emission impact of, e.g., using vanilla beans in an ice cream versus using chemically based flavoring. Would that be included in the database, or is it too specific?
That's a super good question. Currently, vanilla beans or chemical-based substitutes, they cannot be found directly in the database. So that would be something new that should be added. But compared to the time before the database, this has been much easier because vanilla is a crop in the database. So we already have a basis for creating a data set for the vanilla-based product. The chemical-based is something different, but that is something that can be made as well. But that is something that needs some additional work.
Yes, I see. This was a very good answer. I have here another question coming from Priyanka. I'm interested in the consequential approach explained for electricity. I suppose the renewable electricity is increased. Would the CO2 saved be average grid mix or the marginal source? And what is marginal in that case? I think we're actually getting back to some of your explanation of the two approaches. I wonder if it's a bit too specific about
No, it's
electricity.
absolutely fine.
No, you get it? Yes? Okay.
First of all, I would say you start talking about when you're using electricity or when you are saving electricity. There will not be any differences between the two, because if I'm reducing my electricity consumption, then the electricity system in Denmark, they will just produce a little less. If I'm increasing, they will produce a little more. What we're always focusing at is the long-term changes. So we are not really focusing so much on the specific natural gas power plant that is adjusting to every small minute by minute demand changes. We are looking in the longer term. In the longer term, what is happening there is that we are investing in new capacity. So when we are identifying the marginal electricity mix, we are looking at over time which electricity sources are invested in. And there we can identify that in Denmark, around 70% of all new electricity comes from installed capacity of wind power, and the rest, at least if we're looking at current statistics for the last 5 years, that has been based on biomass, electricity based on wood chips, etc. So that is what is currently, that's how capacity is currently increased. So if you increase your electricity demand, then there will be a little bit more capacity increase, because capacity is fitted to meet demand. So there will be additional investments in wind and biomass.
And that's back to our conclusions before, that you're also taking into account the changes in the patterns of use. I think we will have to move ahead because time is running. I think people are interested, and this is good, but I think many are interested as much as I am in the next bit, in which we are digging into how to use the database. The practical use, because now what you have done is you have created a wonderful database with information available. It's an open source, but then if you are a food producing company using vanilla in your ice cream or soy, how is it that you use it in practice?
Okay, there are several different uses. I've brought a few examples here. One example, which we have seen already a number of restaurant chains and food service companies, the approach they have been using is what I'm illustrating on the slide you see here. What they have done is that what you see on the left, that's spend data by the food service company. So they have spent different food items. I've called them food 1, food 2, food 3. Each of them has a certain classification, and then they have an amount in kilograms. What you see on the right, that's just a screen dump of the climate database with the carbon footprint of per kilogram of different food items. Then what is nice with the climate database is that every food item there comes with a acknowledged classification. So all the items, they are classified according to GPC classification as well as FRIDA classification. FRIDA is a specific classification system and database for food items. So every food item, the food 1, 2, 3 you see to the left, they are then, they also need to be classified according to GPC or FRIDA. And then what we can do is that we can actually, from the climate database, we can actually link to the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food item. So it is a relatively simple mapping exercise, and then you can actually have greenhouse gas emissions from the spend of thousands of different users of food.
I see. Who's using it today?
There are a couple of companies, well, I cannot mention all of them, but the ones who have gone into the public announcing that they are using it is Myers and Lykkes Mose. They have been using the climate database to perform greenhouse gas footprints. BC Catering, they have mentioned that they are using it as well. And then finally, the retail chain Netto, which is owned by Salling Group, they are using it for climate labeling of their products, of their food products. I have a few more examples, but I'm not sure I'm allowed to tell it out loud here.
That is interesting. This is a driver in the food industry, and suppliers of the food industry will probably be met with questions on their footprint in the future, we expect. I see that time really is running, and I would like to see, there is a couple of questions. How is the calculation made on byproducts used as substitutes for commercial fertilizers, for example, sludge and substitute for nitrogen and phosphor on farmland? Okay, we have a question back to the farm. Can we do that very briefly?
It should be possible. Let's see, I need to find a slide which we can use for it. We have one example here. Actually, well, what this here shows, it's actually a slide that should tell how different cuts from the slaughterhouse are modeled. You see a picture in the left side of the slide where you have a slaughterhouse. You have some main products of beef cuts going out, and then you have some byproducts, skin, bones, etc. That's one example of byproducts. These kind of materials, they go to the rendering industry. In the rendering industry, such materials, they are, in this specific case here, they will be processed into, if it's beef, a lot of it will be processed into fertilizer and biodiesel. If it's high-risk material, it will be produced into biodiesel, and then some bone meal, which is used as a fuel substitute, that will go to Aalborg Portland, where it's used to substitute fuel. So in that case, if you have a dead cow from the top of the slide, so if you have a dead and sick cow there, that will actually go through the rendering industry and be turned into biodiesel, which substitutes palm oil-based biodiesel, and the bone meal will substitute coal burning in Aalborg Portland. Also, if it's not high-risk material, it will be processed into a fertilizer, which will then substitute mineral fertilizer.
This is a very good example, but it's also an example that makes me think there are quite some questions for the future of this, because as is today, the big climate database is static. I mean, it's a version of the climate database which is with numbers that are settled, defined in that database. Yet I have heard you say that it is up for change. You can add, as you have mentioned, new data for new ingredients or other food products. True. But there are two questions in this. Both one, what is the future of the existing climate database? And do you foresee a future in which it will be more even more flexible? And because some of the examples you give are a bit theoretic, if this being used like that, then thus. But there is also in food, there could be seasonal changes, there could be water that differs and makes a difference on the climate impact of the crop, etc. Meaning that from year to year or from place to place, from season to season, there will be a difference. When will this be added? Can we foresee that?
Yeah. Well, if you just go 10 minutes back in time, I mentioned that the 500 food items is just the top of the iceberg, and then I showed a lot of other stuff below. But actually, what is included, the 500 food items, is actually also in reality just the top of the iceberg.
Yes. Because
you can add thousands of different food items, and for each food item, it could be a pig from a pig farmer. That can come from thousands of different farmers, so you could actually convert it to be usable at the farm level, so each farmer could produce his or her own footprint of their products. You could also, as you mentioned, you could add seasonal differences. So if you buy apples in the right season in Denmark, it will be Danish apples, but at other seasons they will be imported from other countries. You could add different technologies, so you could compare organic farming with conventional farming, or even better, it could be environmentally improved products where you use specific technologies. There are thousands of technologies to abate different emissions in animal production,
Right,
as well as
right.
crop cultivation.
Fortunately, I know we are going to discuss this much more, and I would like to, we have to wrap up for now. Unfortunately, the time is up, but fortunately, we will continue the discussion. I would like to invite all of you listeners to check out the events that Food and Biocluster are putting up, because on the 13th of August, we will be having a second meeting, but this is a physical one in which you can come and hear about some of the tools that can be used for measuring your own climate impact, and in which Yannick will also be there to answer other questions. And I hope that many of you would be interested in following that as well. If you have more questions, don't hesitate. We will wrap up as many as we can in the emails after today. But thank you so much for coming in and bringing a bit of light to what's behind the big climate database today, Yannick.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.